Good evening, it's the end of the week and you're watching The Big Story. I'm Dylan Ang, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. It was announced this afternoon that Singapore will increase the number of MPs in Parliament by 4, as well as do away with 6-member GRCs. If you take a look at the new electoral map, there will now be 14 SMCs and 17 GRCs. These are up from the current 13 SMCs and 16 GRCs. A new 4-member Sengkang GRC will be created. There will also be 4 new SMCs, Kebun Baru, Marymount, Punggol West and Yio Chu Kang. However, Fengshan, Punggol East and Sengkang West have been removed. Olivia is more with the Straits Times news editor Zakir Singh.
Well, thanks, Dylan. So, Zakir, let's get right into it. Gone are the 6-member GRCs like Ang Mo Kio, Pasir Ris, Punggol, which are helmed by Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong and Senior Minister Toh Chee Hian, respectively. So, what do you make of this downsizing? Why do away with these 6-member GRCs?
I think PM had signalled some years back in Parliament that the trend was towards smaller GRCs, and I think the Boundaries Committee probably took note of that. And I think there's a sense that maybe 6-man GRCs can be a bit unwieldy. You have 200 voters, with different, interests as well, being served by a large group of MPs. So I think the sort of more natural state of affairs would be these 4 or 5-men GRCs that would, let you achieve that mix of having multiracial representation and at the same time keep constituency sizes manageable. But there's also the intent of making the elections contestable, having enough SMCs so that, folks who do want to contest an election, the barriers to entry are low. And so you see 1 more SMC this time around. Right.
Well, you mentioned, I guess scaling down the GRCs, and of course now the biggest GRCs will have 5 members, like East Coast and West Coast GRCs will be expanded to have 5 MPs. Yep. Both these areas saw some of the closest contests between the PAP and the Workers' Party during the 2015 GE. So tell us more about the changes to these boundaries at East Coast and West Coast GRCs.
I think in East Coast in 2015 there was sort of an carving out of Fengshan as MC during the last election, and now it's sort of just been moved back in. Actually, to be fair, a lot of on the activity level, a lot of SMCs that are sited next to big GRCs tend to do a lot of activities together anyway. Makes sense. But I think Nix might say, well, it sort of makes it tougher for the opposition to contest in East Coast as well. And then you have Sengkang GRC, which merged several WP strongholds. Yep. Well, WP held Punggol East briefly after winning it in the by-election in 2013. Sengkang West, it did okay. It contested there, but it got more support than it did elsewhere. And Sengkang is a fairly compact town, easy to campaign in. Some might say, well, that's I think many expect the Workers' Party to contest there, and some might say that might help lure them away from East Coast. West Coast was not, I think West Coast was contested by the Reform Party in the 2015 GE. Now you've got Dr. Tan Cheng Bok's Neo Progress Singapore Party wanting to set its sights there. Again, the barriers, moved up slightly. But I think though, these will still probably see some contests in the coming polls.
Well, you mentioned the creation of a new GRC, Sengkang, which has more than 117,000 voters. Yeah. Wow. So which minister do you think will be helming this new GRC?
I'm not sure. There's a chance it might, not be helmed by a new minister. But you do have Minister Ng Chee Meng nearby. And Dr. Lam Pin Min, he's Senior Minister of State, right? He's been there, 2-3 terms now? First
East,
in Sengkang West. Sengkang West, right? So I think whether there's a full minister or not, you've got a strong lineup of folks anchoring it, I'd say.
Okay. Well, I guess this is the million-dollar question. What is the timeline until polling day now that the electoral boundaries have been announced?
Yeah. It's hard to say. I mean, there's a chance it could, even be held in June.
3 months from now?
Yeah, 3 months from now. But I'm inclined to think, I think you might see the polls come around sooner, as early as early April. I mean, Parliament could well be dissolved next week, right? and you see an early April poll, or you might see a poll in, say, mid-April, there's a weekend between Easter and the start of Ramadan that could be a nice window to call an election for.
In that case, are you surprised that, I guess, all of this, the ball starting to roll isn't later on in the year? Because it's very obvious that we're trying to battle COVID-19 at the moment. So we may not have the mental capacity to also, I guess, manage an election.
Yeah, but that's the same case, I think, in many other societies around the world as well. At least 7 or 8 places are, in the middle of election campaigns, or have just had or will have some form of election soon. There are examples of how they take on, extra precautions. So either you step down rallies and you have added checks. The new guidelines on social distancing were issued today.
Yeah.
I think there's still enough avenues for voters to sort of get to know the various candidates, hear what they stand for and their platforms. But at the same time, I think PM's message yesterday made clear that, it's hard to say how the situation will play out in the next few weeks or even months. There are signs it could get worse, and we've talked about the second stimulus package. I think what the government does want to seek is sort of a mandate, to maybe a mandate to kind of put out this package, and a mandate to kind of take some possibly tough measures that might be needed, right? As this COVID situation plays out.
Well, this was announced just a few hours after the multi-ministry task force.
That's right, yeah.
Introduced, more measures to ensure social distancing. So, like what you said, how can, I guess, political parties realistically do all their traditional campaigning, like walkabouts and rallies?
I think they might end up having to scale that down, right? I mean, you can still go around, visit markets, hawker centers. And if you want to take precautions, then don't shake hands,
Definitely not shake hands, yeah.
Apply sanitizer if you do, and so on.
Rallies? How about rallies?
Rallies, you could have sort of town hall style events, but then you've got to cap them to, 200, 250 participants. But begs the question, how effective? I mean, you could have rallies and, live stream them, right? Or you could have rallies in slightly different conditions, right? You could even say, if there was a rally at the stadium, have some form of social distancing, although it might seem a bit odd. And the same thing when you go to the polls, right?
Exactly.
Each polling station has about maybe 2,000 to 3,000 voters. But at the same time, there's sort of between 12 hours, 10 hours to cast your vote. You could perhaps stagger the timings. And as in previous years, I think you can easily manage the flow of voters coming into the polling stations. And I think we might hear more from the elections department on this as the election comes round.
All right. Thank you very much, Zakir. Very informative. That was news editor for the Straits Times, Zakir Hussain.
There is now a question mark over whether large national gatherings like the National Day Parade and the May Day Rally can proceed as normal in light of the COVID-19 outbreak. Speaking at the multi-ministry press conference this morning, National Development Minister Lawrence Wong said the organisers will need to discuss this with the task force. Here's multimedia correspondent Haryanto Diman with more.
I'm here at the National Press Centre where the Multi-Ministry Task Force press briefing was held earlier. As you can see, members of the media were seated apart from one another as the co-chairs of the task force announced a slew of new measures to contain the import of COVID-19 cases as well as curb the spread in Singapore. This comes after the World Health Organization declared the COVID-19 outbreak a pandemic.
The outbreak has now been classified as a pandemic by the World Health Organization. The situation in Singapore remains under control and we are not changing the DORSCON levels. We have been planning ahead and putting in place measures as situation evolved. We cannot be complacent. Despite our best efforts at contact tracing to ring-fence confirmed cases, we still see new cases every day and increasingly more imported cases. Therefore, as cases rise globally, we expect to see spikes in number of cases here in Singapore too. The threat of importation of cases remains serious and imminent, As of 12 March, we had 47 imported cases. This is about 25% of the total number of confirmed cases. Over the past 10 days, there were 23 imported cases, or nearly a third of new cases were imported. In fact, just 2 days ago, on 11 March, we saw our highest number of imported cases since the outbreak began. Border control measures, therefore, remain important in lowering the risk of imported cases.
Singaporeans are to defer all non-essential travel to Italy, France, Spain and Germany. Existing travel advisories against all travel to Hubei province and non-essential travel to the rest of mainland China, Iran, Japan and Korea will remain. Singaporeans are also advised to exercise caution when travelling to all countries affected by COVID-19, especially those who have exported cases. These include neighbouring countries like Indonesia and the Philippines. Singaporeans who have made plans to travel during the upcoming March holidays are advised to review their plans based on this latest advisory. From midnight on March 15th, all new visitors who had been to Italy, France, Spain and Germany within the last 14 days will not be allowed entry or transit through Singapore. At the same time, Singaporeans and permanent residents who had been to the same 4 countries within the last 14 days will be issued a stay-home notice. This means they must stay at home at all times for the 14 days after returning here. The notice will also apply to long-term pass holders under the same circumstances. The task force also outlined additional social distancing measures, including limiting the size of gatherings to 250 people.
We have put out the rule on ticketed events. We would ask all event organizers to take the necessary precautions, bearing in mind the scale of the event, and we've put 250 as a guide, but also, as I highlighted, the principles underpinning the number. Right? The number is a useful guide, but think also about the principles that apply, be it the density, the duration, the nature of the activity. We would then ask all event organizers, whether it's for rallies or for conferences or for any other thing, right? Just think about these guidelines and then apply them accordingly.
All ticketed cultural, sports and entertainment events with 250 participants or more are to be deferred or cancelled. For events they have been committed to, organizers must demonstrate that satisfactory precautionary measures have been put in place before they can proceed. For all other mass gatherings, including private functions and religious services, organizers are advised to put in place these precautions. Meanwhile, employers should put in place measures to reduce close contact, such as implementing telecommuting and video conferencing, staggering work hours, and allowing staff to commute at off-peak hours. With these additional measures in place, the task force stresses the importance of personal responsibilities like regular hand washing and staying at home when unwell, so as to contain the spread of COVID-19.
It was announced yesterday that all 70 mosques in Singapore will be closed for 5 days for cleaning from today. This following the infection of 2 Singaporeans who attended a mass religious gathering in Selangor, Malaysia. Meanwhile, a week after the Catholic Church in Singapore said it would be resuming masses this weekend, Archbishop William Goh said yesterday that public masses will remain suspended. As of last night, there are 187 confirmed cases in Singapore. Olivia, over to you.
I'm joined now by Professor David Chan, who's the Director of the Behavioural Sciences Institute at Singapore Management University. He's here to talk about social responsibility in light of the sweeping COVID-19 measures announced today. So, Prof Chan, earlier this week, Health Minister Gan Kim Yong said numerous cases had not minimized social contact, although they were unwell. Why do you think people continue with their daily routines despite being sick?
Well, I think first, it's quite obvious that when people go out and they start forming clusters because they actually have the COVID-19 virus, people get angry. People like you and me look at these people and we say, well, you get really angry and frustrated. Why do they do it? I think the important thing to note that it could have happened to you and me too. It could have happened to any one of us. And that is, it's very important for us to understand the psychology that's underlying these people's behaviors. Now, why do people do it? Why do people go out and start to infect others? The main point is that they didn't intend to. no one actually intend to go out and start infecting other people, right? It can't be the case. What then is important is for us to understand the underlying psychology. Well, I will put it this way. I think people go out, even though they have flu-like symptoms rather, is because they want to or they feel that they have to. Now, what do I mean by they want to? I think they want to is because if you're interested to attend an event, it could be a social event, it could be going to church, going to a conference, or it could be going to work, to a meeting that you're really looking forward to, or that you have something important to do. And when you want to do something, the psychologist tells us that you tend to underplay the obstacles for you to not do that thing. And so what that means is that you will tell yourself that, oh, my symptoms are not that serious, I can't possibly get the virus, and things like that. So the question is that when we have an interest to do something, there is a tendency to cloud our judgments, and we begin to feel that we want to. But there's another important part, and that is that you feel that you have to. Sometimes you don't want to, but you feel that you have to. And what do I mean by that? And that is, think about it in terms of pressures. Sometimes you don't really want to go to work because you are actually sick, and you could be quite sick. But you feel that you have to because there are deadlines to be met, because you feel that if I don't go, then my colleagues will have to take care of my work, or my boss will not be happy, and so on. So there are external pressures that you perceive, rightly or wrongly, and then you feel that you have to go to work, or you have to go to this gathering, you have to go to this conference. And there's also internal pressures. And those pressures is that you feel that a sense of obligation, a sense of duty. Well, if I don't do it, then who's going to do it? And then you feel that you have to. I just want to reiterate, you could be feeling that you have to, or you want to. You could even have a fear that if I don't go, what happened? None of these actually justify you going out. It explains psychologically why you are doing it. And when we are aware, then we've got to be more socially responsible. It doesn't mean that because this is the underlying psychology, well, then we can justify ourselves and say, let's go out and it's fine, you know, if others get infected and take a chance. And that's not the right thing to do.
So, I guess as a counterbalance to all these pressures that you mentioned, how can we make sure then that people behave more socially responsible?
Well, the narrative that we've been hearing, narrative used in a good sense, that you need to have an SG united. You know, by that, I guess it means that we need to have a united response. Everyone needs to play a part. It doesn't matter who you are. It's not really the duty of just the politicians to do it. You know, it could be the employers, it could be the colleagues, it could be family members, and so on. So number one is to understand that for this to be contained, or for the situation to not get much worse than it is or it will be, is to recognize that we all need to play a part. Then the important practical question is that how do we do it? And I would argue that the united response is possible only if we understand actually how people think and how people feel and how people behave. So you need to understand the underlying factors that affects people's behaviors. We could talk about people's values, you could talk about how to cultivate norms, you could talk about enforcement, making it very effective and making sure that things that you need people to do are simple and it can be convenient. I won't have time to go into all these technical details. I've written a commentary that will actually appear in about 12 hours time, I think, because that's tomorrow's Straits Times in the opinion page. And in that, I try to delineate what are some of the factors and some of the things that we can do quite concretely.
Well, National Development Minister Lawrence Wong, he said earlier this week that improving public hygiene is the easiest to tackle, whereas personal hygiene and social norms are harder to influence. He actually said this at the launch of the SG Clean Task Force this week. So do you think the task force will encounter problems when it comes to trying to change people's mindsets?
I think, yes, there'll definitely be a problem. I think what Minister Wong is saying, public hygiene is easier, personal hygiene is more difficult. By public hygiene, I would think that he meant having certain rules of making sure that things are clean, places are clean. Not public hygiene in the sense of if I go to eat, you know, I make sure that I clean up after me. That's actually personal hygiene for public health. I think what he meant and what most of us know is that personal hygiene is a bit difficult because it's personal habits. It also involves social norms and so on. So yes, there will be challenge, and I think there's a challenge that we, and the task force probably will recognize and will need to recognize, if not already, is that it's not like just another national campaign, because in a national campaign, you can think long term. In this case, we have an urgent situation that we need to change behaviors. So let's do that, but at the same time, to make sure that you do it in a way that the norms can be sustained and be permanent.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Chan, for coming on. I've been speaking to Professor David Chan, Director of the Behavioral Sciences Institute at SMU.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's wife, Sophie Gregoire Trudeau, has tested positive for coronavirus. According to his office, Mr. Trudeau is currently in good health with no symptoms. The couple are now self-isolating. In the Philippines, President Rodrigo Duterte announced plans for a sweeping lockdown of Manila. It's a bid to stem the spread before it takes firm root in the capital's densely packed neighborhoods. He also announced a month of school closures, a ban of mass gatherings, and a halt to domestic travel. US President Donald Trump has said that he isn't concerned about the possibility of being exposed to the virus after dining with an infected Brazilian government official last week. Just days before he tested positive, the press secretary to Brazil's president had uploaded a picture posing next to President Trump, as well as Vice President Mike Pence. The White House said that both Mr. Trump and Pence had almost no interactions with the individual and don't require to be tested at this time. We're joined now by US Bureau Chief Nirmal Ghosh, who's based in Washington, D.C. Nirmal, when we last spoke, the US authorities were struggling to get enough test kits. How has that situation progressed?
It is still failing. Over 1 million test kits are out there now. Private labs are also offering tests, and some of the associated cost of getting a test, they've been waived. But you need certain chemical agents to conduct these tests, and those are short. So you have a situation where in some cases doctors have the tests, but not the agents, so the tests can't be used. So you can say some progress, but still rather shambolic. Still way below the level of testing necessary to get a proper handle on the extent of this coronavirus here in the United States. President Trump, for instance, says the US has fewer cases than other countries, but we can't know that for certain because they haven't done more than a few thousand tests. So we don't know how many people out there have the virus.
Now, what do you make of the US ban on travelers coming from Europe, with the exception of the United Kingdom, of course? Do you think that it is sufficient, or will it do more harm than good in terms of bilateral relations? Is this the first of many travel bans?
Yes, the logic of it is that most new infections recently have been in Europe or from Europe, and Europe is borderless, so it doesn't make sense to ban travel from any single country, say Italy or France or Germany. So they had to ban travel from all of Europe. The UK doesn't figure there because it is now not part of the European Union. And by the way, President Trump sort of likes that. He advocated Brexit and he is a fan of strong borders. So the travel ban closes the barn door after the horse has left, essentially. The virus is already here in the US and circulating. We already have community transmission in the US. Now, the US, as we know, isn't the only one to impose some form of travel ban. India this week suspended all current visas, for example. So all these measures do buy some time. In this case, it was done without notifying European countries. There is chaos in several European airports and a massive hit for the airline industry, leave alone associated travel-related services. There are more than 500 flights per week between Europe and the United States. In terms of bilateral relations, it doesn't do any good, but in the greater scheme, probably not that much harm. Europe and everyone else simply has to cope with a strong element of unilateralism of the United States under Donald Trump.
Now, how would you rate Mr. Trump's second address from the Oval Office? Such addresses to the nation can be defining moments for a president to act as commander-in-chief or consoler-in-chief. Was it one for the ages?
It came a bit late in the day, and the president misspoke, giving the impression that cargo and goods from Europe would also be subject to the ban. Later, he had to clarify that isn't the case. So not a great performance. It tanked the market again, of course. I saw the New York Fed said it will inject $1.5 trillion into short-term funding markets. So you would have to say the address did not inspire a lot of confidence. And by the way, it was interesting that the president referred to the coronavirus as a quote-unquote foreign virus, which has raised a lot of eyebrows as well. Now, having said that, it does signal a shift in the mood. The NBA has cancelled its season. That's a huge deal. Other major events have been scaled back or cancelled. Thousands of schools across the country are now suspended, and kids have shifted to online learning. So this is now affecting people's lives, and people are also being proactive. The New York subway is almost half empty. Broadway has suspended all shows. So there are still things happening. It's not as if everything is at an absolute standstill, but there is a significant shift. There's a wider public perception that this just got very real. And things are moving on from the president's address, actually. Health experts have been in Congress today testifying. Congress is working on a bill. Democrats have been negotiating with the White House all day. And Speaker Nancy Pelosi said the House will vote Thursday on a package of measures to address this crisis, and it will include the payroll tax cut the President mentioned as economic relief. There is also a chance the President will declare a national state of emergency, which would unleash more resources.
Thank you, Normal.
Thank
Always
you.
Insightful. Now, that was our US Bureau Chief, Norma Ghosh. Now, do visit straitstimes.com for developments on the coronavirus situation in the US and the rest of the world. Several sporting events have been affected by the outbreak as well. The English Premier League will convene an emergency meeting later tonight regarding future fixtures. Each club has about 9 more games left to play. The meeting comes after both Arsenal manager Mikel Arteta and Chelsea player Callum Hudson-Odoi tested positive for COVID-19.
Personnel who had come into contact with the two individuals have begun self-isolating. Arsenal said that it expects a significant number of people will self-isolate, including the full first-team squad.
In Formula One, the season-opening Australian Grand Prix, which was set to flag off this weekend, has also been cancelled, just 2 hours before the first practice was scheduled to begin. This follows the confirmation that a member of the McLaren team tested positive.
The PGA Tour has cancelled its flagship Players' Championship after the first round was played. The event features stars like Rory McIlroy and Phil Mickelson.
Back in Singapore, race organisers announced that the Sundown Marathon, which was originally scheduled for May 23rd, will no longer take place for the first time in its 13-year history.
Well, here to tell us more is correspondent Sazali Abdul Aziz. Sazali, the Aussie Grand Prix is one of the higher-profile sports events that have been cancelled or postponed. But what will this mean for the Formula One season?
Well, it leaves a major question mark over the season in general. Already, the Chinese Grand Prix has been cancelled, and the Bahrain GP coming up on March 22nd is currently set to go ahead without fans, but that could well change in the coming weeks as well. The Singapore GP is scheduled for September, so I guess there's no need for a decision as yet. But I suppose with stops in Spain, France, and Italy before Singapore, I think we have to expect many more twists and turns, pun intended, before the race arrives to Singapore. And unfortunately, maybe the drivers seem to react that it's an inevitable thing to cancel the race, for people's health and safety. The drivers are sportive, but I think the fans are not really pleased. As you mentioned, it's very last minute. Some fans have traveled halfway around the world, so they've left with a very disappointing outcome.
Now, Sazali, we'll find out what happens to the rest of the Premier League season later tonight with Arteta and Hudson-Odoi testing positive. Do you think we could see the EPL take unprecedented action?
Yeah, again, I think it's inevitable. We will see some kind of directive passed down by the Premier League and for EFL clubs as well, the Football League clubs. I think early indications are that the league will postpone this weekend and next, and then use the time over the international break to reassess the situation. The international break ends on March 31st. All the other major football leagues in Europe have already taken action in some way or another, suspending their league for a few weeks or playing behind closed doors. And it has, in some of those cases, it has shown that playing behind closed doors may not be the solution. In Germany, for example, hundreds of fans gathered outside the stadium of Mönchengladbach, creating the very crowd that league organizers are trying to avoid. So it really is an unprecedented situation, and so different leagues and different sports have to really weigh what their options are and make a decision. So we'll have to wait and see what the Premier League decides.
Right.
Yep. Well, Sazali, I understand you're working on a story about how local sports events are affected. Tell us more.
Yeah, as you mentioned, Sundown Marathon is already one of those events that have been disrupted. And this morning, as we discussed earlier on the big story as well, the government announced further measures, social distancing, and to curb the spread of COVID-19 in the country. And we've learned over the day of a few disruptions. The ASEAN Basketball League, which features the Singapore Slingers, have already suspended the league indefinitely. The Singapore Badminton Open is set to announce its cancellation. It's not official yet, but this is based on sources that I've spoken to. And the Singapore Premier League as well, they have not officially announced it, but I understand they are set to go on and play games behind closed doors, which is a shame because we've seen some games draw over 2,500 people to stadiums since the league kicked off this season 2 weeks ago. So, it's a very disappointing situation, but then again, inevitable that you have to do something.
Well, thank you very much for your time, Sazali. You can head over to straitstimes.com for all the COVID-19 developments in the sporting world.
And those are our top stories for today. For more news and videos, log on to straitstimes.com. I'm Dylan Ang with Oliver Quay. Have a good weekend and join us next week for more stories on The Big Story.